to the Friends of the Cabildo member lecture series. If this is your first time, welcome. And if this is you're a repeat person, we're glad to have you back. And if this is your first time, just know that this is free for all members. And so you can become a member for as low as $40. And we have tons of programming throughout the year. Most years we have live concerts and nice films, and as well as lectures like this, symposiums, stuff like that. So we think you get a lot out of it if you become a member. But tonight, let me mention one other thing. One other thing is our next two member lectures are right now April 20th and April 27th. And one is on, actually both are music related. One is on the songs, the diasporas of the Canary Islanders and music from, talking about the music that comes from the Canary Islands. So the Islanders from St. Bernard Parish. And then the 27th is on Louis Moreau Gottschalk. So I hope you will join us for those. Tonight, our lecture is going to be on Harold Battiste. Our presenter is Dave Thomas. Dave kicked off the member lecture series talking about Earl Palmer. So it was a great talk that night. So I'm expecting, as always, a great talk again. Dave is a longtime member of the Friends, tour guide. He's a musician, he's a drummer, and he's also run our training for all of the Ken Burns jazz tours we've done the last couple of years. Hello, Karen, how are you? And so we have, so Dave is very well versed on this, but he wanted to find an area that he thought was interesting to him and he wanted to explore more. So with that, we're going to talk about Harold Battiste and welcome Dave Thomas. Thank you so much, Dave.
Thank you. Let's go ahead and start the screen sharing. Let me see. Is that right? Okay, so everybody should see a slide with a big headshot of Harold to the right.
Yep, we see it.
All right, perfect. So we're going to talk about Harold for, hopefully just shy of an hour. And I called this, Yeah, But Does It Sound Good? Because I crossed paths with Harold as part of the UNO Jazz Performance Program. I was participating in it from the late 90s to the early 2000s. And one of the most impressive things about Harold was this was kind of his mantra. He was all about theory and good practice and whatever, but he basically, his ultimate test for music was, yeah, but does it sound good? I don't care what the theory says, does it sound good? And so that was a philosophy that permeated almost everything he did. And I call this part of the Can't Get No Respect music series because Harold is one of the musicians to me who's underappreciated. It's not that he's not completely unappreciated, but to me, he was involved in so much stuff, and he was not necessarily as a front man, but he was part of the fabric that held a lot of music together. And those people generally, I think, are underappreciated. And Harold is one of those people that I wanted to shine more of a light on. I would describe him as a New Orleans raised musician, educator, mentor, and an entrepreneur. And so the reason we're talking about him, I'd like to get right to the punchline. This is what I think his legacy is. And I sort of ranked it more or less in the order that I think the significance is. He documented the modern jazz scene in New Orleans in the early 1960s, substantially, if not completely, through these AFO recordings he did. And this was at a time when nobody thought there was any modern jazz coming out of New Orleans. So if it wasn't for him, this stuff would have been almost completely undocumented in terms of recordings. And he also later produced silver books, which are essentially written versions of a lot of the iconic New Orleans modern jazz songs. And he has spent much of his life, particularly the later part at UNO, mentoring younger performers. Probably the most high profile thing he did, it was Sonny and Cher music director for over, bits and pieces over about a 15-year period. He helped spawn the Dr. John character out on the West Coast. And he was a producer and or an arranger on a bunch of national hits, both from here in New Orleans and Los Angeles. So it's a big package. I'm going to hit the early part of his life very quickly. I don't mean to shortchange it, but there's so much music to get to that I just feel like I've got to skate over a lot of this early stuff. Nuts and bolts, he was born in 1931. Mother was a pearl booker. His father was also a herald from Vacherie, Louisiana, and he apparently changed the name from Battiste. B-A-P-T was the initial spelling. And according to Harold, it was because Battiste was thought of more of a low-class spelling. So as you probably know, many of you, if you're from New Orleans, you know, we got Baptiste of all sorts of spellings. We got Harold with two T's, we got Baptiste, which also has some musical people as PT, and then lots of Battiste with a single T. His education, 1943, he was exposed to the saxophone and started playing clarinet. He went to Gilbert Academy up on St. Charles Avenue, playing third clarinet and learning to do transcriptions by ear. The academy is gone, the building is gone. It was a beautiful Gothic building, which the photo is here, but there is a plaque. It's a plaque approximately where De La Salle school is right now. And this plaque is right out in front of the school, I believe, on the corner. And then he went to college at Dillard University, music education major. And at the time he was there, jazz was more or less officially discouraged. Early influences, white swing bands on the radio, R&B and jump blues, particularly two people he singled out were Louis Jordan and Eddie Cleanhead Vinson. Louis Jordan was probably the most high-profile jump blues player following the post-war years, or in the post-war years. And I think it's interesting that he singled out these two guys as influences because Harold was a multi-instrumentalist. He played multiple saxophones, piano, dabbled in bass, clarinet, started on clarinet, but the instrument that I think we most identify him with is probably the alto saxophone. And these two guys that he singled out as influences were both alto players. And he lived multiple locations in Central City, in a couple of locations right across the street from the Dewdrop Lounge in the Magnolia Project. So he would hear Dave Bartholomew rehearsals, and he got exposed to some of the touring performers, Ray Charles, Charles Brown, Big Joe Turner. Big Joe Turner was the original guy of Shake, Rattle, and Roll. Charles Brown, probably Merry Christmas Baby is his big hit. So that's the kind of stuff he was listening to. Early playing around his college time, there was an Army Reserve band that he was in. He got exposed to a duo called the Groovy Boys, which was Roger Dickerson on piano and Ellis Marcellus saxophone. And he hooked up with Ellis. Ellis actually was still in high school when they connected. And Harold was at Dillard and started a jazz trio, clarinet, bass, and piano. He played with the Joe Jones band at the Pentagon, and he also worked with the Johnson Brothers band for a while. In one of the two Johnson brothers was Plas Johnson on tenor saxophone, who we're going to hear about later. And so you're going to see several of these names come up later in his career. This is where he's starting to make connections that are going to pop up later. Quick highlights of his family, his married years. He was married to Alviette Marie Antoinette Dominique. Excuse me, I had an alarm going off there. They met in 1949, married in 1953. They had a brief separation in 1970, a permanent separation in 1985, and finally got divorced in 1987. 4 children: Harold Raymond Battiste III, Andrea Lynn, Marzik Khadija, and Harless Ray. And this actually is one of the residences. This is a photo of one of the places Harold lived, which is in Jason and I's neighborhood. I think sometimes it's described as Holly Grove, although I would think of it more as Leonidas. It's on Hickory Street between Carrollton Avenue and the river. And this is actually, we walk around the neighborhood a lot, my wife and I do. So I actually took the picture. So after Dillard, he has a couple of teaching experiences, both of which end kind of badly. He's teaching in DeRidder and Beauregard Parish for a couple of years. he's basically starting a band from scratch, and he's getting experience writing music for school concerts. And he has a bad ending with the Jim Crow experience. He goes before the white school board with his principal, and they're asking for money for band uniforms and instruments, I think. And they're basically treated appallingly. The school board members complain that, oh, you're always coming back here asking for money. And so he basically gave up on DeRitter because of this Jim Crow experience, and then had a similar experience when he was teaching in New Orleans. At one point he was told when teaching his Black students not to bother to teaching them to read. They didn't really need to learn that stuff, reading music, of course. So the education experiences at this point were not really good. So he's gigging a little bit through this period, although education is his primary occupation. He's playing baritone sax with the Joe Jones Band, and he becomes part of this American jazz quintet with him on saxophone, tenor saxophone, Ed Blackwell on drums, Alvin Battiste on clarinet, and Richard Payne was the nominal bass player, although I think William Swanson was on most of the recordings, and Ellis Marsalis is the piano player. And they actually got some recordings done in 1956. So these are some of the early recordings of modern jazz, contemporary jazz in New Orleans. And among other things about the band, it's kind of interesting on the instrumentation that one of their frontline players is a clarinet player, Alvin Battiste. And you don't have a lot of clarinet players in modern jazz, particularly at that time or really at any time. So it's kind of a uniquely New Orleans spin on the music. And this is, they recorded several compositions of Harold's, and Carrie May is one of them. Check this out. So that was Harold taking the solo there. The recordings to me sound a little primitive, not just the recording quality, but I think some of the musicians really haven't found themselves yet. Ed Blackwell in particular, I think is going to improve a whole lot more. But I think the horn players, Harold and Alvin, acquit themselves fairly well in the sessions. Around this time, he also starts exploring his Black identity. He's exposed to the Nation of Islam by a fellow who hung around the Dewdrop Inn. And in 1958, I think Umar Sharif actually gets him into the Nation of Islam. So theoretically, his name officially then becomes Harold X. Although Harold only partially embraced it, he specifically said he never bought into the whole white devil thing. But it was laying a foundation, I think, for an identity that he would explore off and on through his career, through his different projects. In particular, in the early 1970s, he really bonded with this book called African Genesis, a personal investigation into the animal origins and nature of man. And he actually started working on an album that he described as an African album with Sonny Bono. They never got it completed because of a creative difference between Sonny and Harold Battiste. Surprise, surprise. But apparently there are 4 tracks that they actually finished. He did wind up doing the theme for a documentary on Angela Davis, Portrait of a Revolutionary. So 1956, he's not working in education anymore. Ornette Coleman comes through New Orleans and then heads west. And so Ed Blackwell, Ellis, and Harold decide to go do a road trip out west to check it out. And they get there, and apparently the day they get there, they unpack their instruments, and they're playing in Ornette Coleman's apartment. And they eventually record some demos of his music. And Ed Blackwell would eventually go on to become Ornette Coleman's drummer. They're playing one night a week at a place that Harold described as a Mexican joint. And he gets hooked up with Specialty Records, specifically Bumps Blackwell and Art Roop, signed on as a New Orleans talent scout. And Bumps Blackwell is significant because he's the guy that was on the Little Richard sessions that really launched his career here in New Orleans. It was Specialty Records, and he was doing sessions at J&M Studios on Rampart Street when they recorded Tutti Frutti, and then at Cosmos various studios, all of the string of Little Richard hits. So that's who he connects up with. While he's there, he gets kind of drafted into his first Sam Cooke session. And essentially it's Specialty's first Sam Cooke session. It's in 1957, and they've picked out Summertime as the A side of the record. And they need a B side. So Harold gets designated to come up with a B side. There's a bunch of audition recordings or demo recordings that Sam Cooke had done just with him on a guitar. And Harold finds You Send Me and decides to pick that. So he works up an arrangement with these white voices. They're literally white background singers. So Art Roop comes in and hears the recordings, and he just totally loses it. He's kind of like, what are you doing? Because Sam Cooke had been with the Soul Stirrers, a gospel group that was fairly high profile, and he was trying to branch out as a secular pop musician. And that's why Art Roop signed him up, because he wants to do some soul music. And now these guys, Bumps and Harold, come up with this white sounding music. So as part of kind of checking out of the session, Art Roop doesn't want to pay for it. So the masters are given to Bumps Blackwell, and they're released on the King label. And we know what happened. They ship the records. The DJs are told, Summertime's the A side. That's what we want you to push. Well, they flip it over and they start listening to You Send Me. And of course, You Send Me takes it off and becomes the first big hit for Sam Cooke as Sam Cooke. So you got a hit single, you got to have a follow-up album. So Sonny Bono is already involved in Specialty Records on the West Coast. Basically, he got in the door, I would describe as kind of a flunky, and eventually works his way up to an A&R position. So he's hired as a songwriter for some of the stuff for the album. Harold goes in and embellishes some of the audition recordings, chord arrangements for musicians, and he uses, again, the Lee Gotch singers. So these are the same singers, backup singers, that Art Roop had fired from the single session that he didn't like. And Sonny hired the musicians. So Harold is sent back to New Orleans to act as the A&R man in New Orleans for Specialty. And A&R is artists and repertoire, for those aren't familiar with the term. And it's basically a producer, but it's a much, much bigger job than a producer, at least it was back then. Their job could encompass finding the talent, setting up the session, hiring the musicians, arranging the songs, picking out the material. It basically would cover the whole session potentially, except for the front performer. And he opened up an office on 1463 North Claiborne Avenue. It was above a music store called Houston's for Music. And it was fortuitous because it was William Houston, who was the union president and also music director at L.B. Landry High School, and he ran a society band. And Harold basically thanked William Houston for being being able to work above his record store because he thought it doing business. And Houston told him, no, I'm happy to have you because you're drawing people into my music store. Art Rupe was very hands-on, and apparently he rejected Alan Toussaint, Irma Thomas, and Chris Kenner as candidates for the label. And Harold is more or less fired in March of 1959. It's not really because he messed up. Art Rupe is getting disenchanted, and I would call it a retrenchment. He didn't really close the label, but he's kind of cutting back, and losing the representation in New Orleans is one of the things he cuts back on. However, in the 2 years that he's there, Harold does some very interesting stuff. One of their early hits is Lights Out by Jerry Byrne. It's actually a Mac Rebennack composition. So Mac Rebennack is part of this whole posse of studio people, and it's got Art Neville on piano. And they also recorded Chaduki Doo, which now we think of as an Art Neville classic, of course. Chaduki Doo, Chaduki Doo, I love you, yes indeed. Well, whoa, baby, I love you, yes indeed. And they had some other artists on the label that didn't really have quite an impact. Roy Montrell, a guitar player, was one of the people that's going to figure later in some of the activities of Harold. There's also a session they do for Joe Jones. So this is the guy that Harold had worked with. And they put together a small band, and they cut a version of You Talk Too Much, which reached number 3 and number 9 on the 2 major charts. So dancing is okay on this session. I forgot to mention that. If you feel like you need to get up and dance, some of these songs are pretty danceable. So they go on a station wagon promotion tour. They basically throw a bunch of merchandise in a station wagon and drive across the country, wind up in New York. And it gets a little sticky because at that time, they find out that Joe had not told them that there was a prior roulette recording. So there was a little bit of a sticky situation, but basically they finally worked it out so that the song got released simultaneously on Rick Records, which is what Harold had recorded it for, and on Roulette. While he was up there, he also did a New York session that had Leo Morris coming up from New Orleans as a drummer. And he would later be known as Idris Muhammad, who was a big presence in New York on the jazz scene and also in a lot of theater work. And apparently he made a big splash coming up from this session when all these session people in New York heard how the New Orleans drummers sound. So 1961, Harold realizes that basically a lot of these key musicians, session players specifically, are getting cut out of the lucrative side of the business. Sorry, this is not 1961. He realizes that everybody's going home with a check from a session, but he kind of does a quick math calculation that says, well, if we're getting paid royalties, even tiny royalties, the amount of money that we would make would dwarf what we're getting from these sessions. So he creates a label, which is, let me call it a music label. It's a very all-encompassing label that is owned by the musicians. The musicians that make up the collective own the label. And he said he founded it on Nguzu Saba principle, 7 principles of Kwanzaa. And we think it's the first Black performer-owned music company. So there have been, much earlier, there have been record companies, for example, that were Black owned for Black performers and targeted to a Black market. And Black Swan was probably the most high profile of those, and that's back in 1920. But it didn't have the aspect of collective ownership, basically, that the musicians were owning the property. So they come into business at the end of May in 1961. They leverage free studio time from his job as a Rick Records A&R man, and recruit some of the cream of the New Orleans musicians to be part of it. Alan Toussaint was one of those people, although he had some contract conflicts, so he later became disassociated. But Roy Montrell, the guitar player we talked about, is one of them. Red Tyler, just a saxophone player that was on almost every stinking record that came out in New Orleans for a certain period, was there. And his main partner was Melvin Lasty, who was a cornet player and also the union rep for Local 496. So this is a period when we still had 2 unions in New Orleans that was segregated. 174 was the white union and 496 was the Black union, used to be on Claiborne Avenue. So they go into their first session on Cosmos and Governor Nichols. That's Cosmo up in the corner, and this is a more contemporary picture of the front of what had been the studios. Most of the musicians, not all of them, but most of them are members of AFO, All for One. And they do a split session. They cut 2 songs. One for a guy that there's a performing name called Prince Lala. He was the brother of the guitarist for Fats Domino. You've been heard on me. Didn't really get a lot of traction, but the one that really exploded for them was a song by Barbara George called I Know. And it was based on the chords from Just a Closer Walk with Thee. And one of the interesting things about it is for the instrumental break, the instrumental solo after a couple of vocal choruses, from that time period, especially coming out of New Orleans, it would have been all honking saxophone. That's what you would have heard and you expected to hear. And as a change up, they used a cornet solo instead of a saxophone solo. And think that was actually a defining part of the success of the record. So that was the cornet solo I was talking about. It's interesting. So Mac Revenack, who was in for a while was in similar circles with Harold, both in New Orleans and out on the West Coast. He claims that this recording with that feature cornet actually paved the way for later things like Herb Alpert, which to me is a fairly significant thing if that was true, or if it is true. They also do a session with Lee Dorsey. Harold had previously arranged Lottie Moe and Lover of Love. Alan Toussaint can't pick up this session, so he tells him, go get Harold, and they wind up doing Yaya.
Oh, well, I'm sitting here long, waiting for my Yaya. I'm sitting here long, waiting for my Yaya. It sounds funny, but I don't believe she's coming.
They had a lot of other artists they worked with, not really many of whom got a lot of traction. Some of the names that might look familiar would be James Booker, Mac Rebenak, and Ronnie Barron were Dritz and Dravey, Johnny Adams, and also the Ellis Marsalis Quartet, of course, is including the American Jazz Quintet too. And they had a subsidiary label called At Last. One of the things that Harold gets recorded is the Ellis Marsalis Quartet. He was playing it, so his father had a hotel out on River Road, and they had a music venue called the Music Haven. So they tried to do some live recordings out there and basically went bust. So they went into the studio and recorded this, this quartet that Ellis had at the time. It really, the quartet, the foundation of the quartet was from Ellis's gigs working at the Playboy Club in the Quarter. The Playboy Club was very supportive of modern jazz, so it gave some local musicians a chance to work and play that. And it got released as created as an album called Monkey Puzzle, which had this lineup. If you look to the left, this is what the songs were on the record. And they were almost all written by band members, either James Black, the drummer, or Ellis. And then it was reissued much later in a revival of the AFO label. And they added some other tracks, which are listed over here on the right. That's why you see two different album covers here. The original one was up here called Monkey Puzzle, and the reissue was called Classic Ellis Marsalis. This music is really good. This is 1963, and this is some wonderful modern jazz that was coming out of New Orleans, and nobody's paying any attention to it. A lot of this repertoire is stuff that you would still hear if you went to hear Ellis, playing up until he died. 12's It to me is kind of one of the tunes. I swear more than half the times I went to see him, he always played 12's It in his set. It's a great song. And of course was Ellis taking the solo. If it wasn't for Harold and All for One, it's possible that this music might never have been documented. I would say more than possible, likely. So he had a flirtation with Los Angeles. 1963 in the summer, he decides to go back to Los Angeles. And essentially the whole AFO organization, specifically the executives, which is what they called the house band, all the owners of the co-op, decide to go out to Los Angeles to attend a convention. And since they're staying out there, they basically shut down the AFO operation in New Orleans, which means they're shutting down AFO. And they're getting into various kinds of work out there. Harold winds up making a chart of Lipstick Traces for the OJs, which becomes their first hit. It's a kind of a lesser hit, but I love this because it's basically the Benny Smellman arrangement, if you're familiar with that. So I think of the OJs as one of these 70s disco bands, big hair. This is what they look like. This is a picture of the OJs at the time that Harold was working for this. And then they get plugged back into Sam Cooke. Sam Cooke is very, very supportive of this AFO business model. He's essentially doing the same thing with the company he called SAR. So the artists can own their creative material. So the AFO people open up a space called Soul Station #1, and it's kind of a general business center, but it specifically includes a rehearsal space. So the SAR artists, before the recording, they come in and use this rehearsal space. It's Soul Station #1. And it's actually the AFO executives playing on Sam Cooke's version of Tennessee Waltz. We all know Tennessee Waltz, right? I was dancing with my darling. Well, that's not Sam Cooke's version. In fact, it's not even a waltz. So what puts an end to this is, of course, the horrible shooting, Sam Cooke in 1964. It's the end of Soul Station #1, and it's basically the end of what's holding the executives together. So they scatter. Some stay in LA. Red Tyler comes back to New Orleans. Some go to New York. And so that really is now the end of the AFO nucleus. Through this period, Harold is also working on Phil Spector sessions. Phil Spector is the guy that's credited with creating what they call a wall of sound for his songs. So think of the Ronettes. And what a session would be, you get 3 or 4 guitar players, you'd get 3 or 4 keyboard players, and he would just pack the studio with instruments to duplicate parts or just play all these parts so it sounded really, really dense. And he puts this reverb, really heavy reverb on top of it, so it has a very distinct sound. And Harold is actually playing the part that was designated as free piano, meaning he didn't have to play the written part. It was his job just to fill in stuff. And that came to influence a lot of the earlier stuff, earlier versions of some of the stuff that followed. So he got hooked up to Phil Spector through Sonny, going back to their relationship as complementing A&R men on the 2 different operations and specialty. And so Sonny shows up at the Soul Station with his girlfriend, who's a singer, and he wants them to start working on a career as a couple, as a duo. And so Harold writes charts for their first single, a song called The Letter, which is not very good. It's released under the name of Caesar and Cleo because Cleopatra, the movie, was out at that time with Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor. And so Sonny Bono, who thinks he's a business genius, is going to leverage the movie fame. Then he comes with a song called I Got You, Babe. And he brings it in kind of a waltz feel. And a waltz is kind of clunky, especially for pop music. It's, if you think of the German tuba bands, it's a refined version of a boom, pop, pop, boom, pop, pop, boom, pop, pop. Well, Harold takes that same rhythmic that time in 3, and converts it into 6/8, which is just 2 3s, and puts backbeats in there, and essentially makes this a song that's worth listening to. And so Mac Rebennack is, like I said, he's kind of going in these same circles. So he was involved in Phil Spector sessions and sees a lot of this stuff that Harold is working on and doing with Sonny and Cher. And he does not have, so one of the interesting things about Dr. John is he has an interesting way of describing things, and he really does not have much filter when he talks about them. So there's some great quotes from his biography, Under a Hoodoo Moon. And at the bottom, I picked out one. He says, Sonny seemed to know only 2 chords on the piano, so every song he wrote used the same 2 chords over and over. And Harold took these songs and heroically made them sound like real music. So this is how you get real music. So the sound here is it's classically this Phil Spector derivative sound. It's very dense. Your instruments like a keyboard and what sound like orchestra bells doubling a kind of a melodic line in the background, and lots of reverb on top of this. So he's continuing this relationship with him. There's a first album, there's a 4-month tour that he runs on as a music director. What Now My Love, Bang Bang, theme for Alfie. And again, Dr. John had a very laudatory interpretation of what Harold did for Bang Bang. He said one of the songs that Harold really did write was Cher's Bang Bang. I was at Sonny's garage one night and he was hammering out his usual 2 chords. You could hear the essence of a song in there somewhere, but it took Harold to make it happen. And he kind of sums it up by saying Harold was Sonny's producer, even if he didn't get credit. And you can hear that in this version of Bang Bang. It's very, very ornate. A lot of different influences.
I was 5 and he was 6. We rode on horses made of sticks. He wore black and I wore white. He would always win me back. Bang, bang. He shut me down. Bang, bang. I hit the ground. Bang, bang. That awful sound. Bang, bang. My baby shut me down.
So you can hear there's a lot there, all this percussion, strings. So it goes on. Sonny gets it in his head. He's going to make a movie called Good Times, which Harold scored. And this was a new experience for him. And he was really kind of proud of this. Unfortunately, he signed a contract that said they could transfer the credit for the compositions to anybody they wanted to. And they credited him to Sonny Bono. And he didn't write this stuff. This is just film scoring. And Harold's actually got lead sheets that show his name on the original scores, and then later versions of the scores that show Sonny Bono's name on it. There was more work. The Beat Goes On, European and US tours. They do a second album. There's a second film called Chastity, which is actually a mess. And finally, Harold gives up. He just splits with Sonny because of these contractual shenanigans. And he basically described the experience as kind of working on a plantation. Well, he does go back with them later, or at least off and on, maybe is a better way to say it. He does a 1970 tour with them that actually started at the Blue Room in New Orleans. They were here for 3 weeks, and as you can imagine, it didn't go over very well. It was the wrong market for them. They were kind of refined hippie version. That was their image. And the Blue Room, for sure back then, was this supper club. So it was just not a good thing. He did the so-called Playboy tour with them. They were touring on a Playboy jet, but he wasn't the music director. He just played organ, which he was very happy with. He liked essentially not being in charge of an operation that he really didn't appreciate. And they did, Sonny and Cher did a show called the Sonny and Cher Comedy Hour for a few years, and they tried to enlist Harold to do it, and he didn't do it. He turned him down because he just didn't really need the shenanigans. They were married at the time. They got divorced and tried separate careers, including separate TV shows, and they went flat. So they actually got back together again after they're divorced as the Sonny and Cher show that ran for 2 seasons. And Harold was the music director on that. He basically took care of all the music for this show. The other person that he was involved with very heavily around this time was Mac Rebennack, and specifically in the creation of this Dr. John character. So before 1967, specifically before the creation of this Gree album, there was no Dr. John. It was Mac Rebennack, Malcolm Rebennack, a studio guy from New Orleans. And Mac gets this vision of wanting to create this character, this swampy, voodoo-inspired character from New Orleans, or at least influenced by New Orleans. So they go in and record an album called Gree under the name of Dr. John the Night Tripper. And the irony in the project was that Mac did not perceive himself as a front man. He thought, I'm not a good singer. And, you know, I mean, he can get by, but he's probably not the best singer. Ronnie Barron, the guy that he'd been working with from back in New Orleans, was going to be the front man, but Ronnie pulled out as the front man at the last minute. They didn't want to cancel the project. So Mac steps up to become the Dr. John character. And this is literally where it's defined. You can hear it in this kind of title song, Ree Gumbo Ya Ya.
They call me Dr. Jones, known as the Night Tripper. Got my satchel of degrees in my hand.
Probably the most well-known cut from the album is this one, I Walk on Gilded Splinters.
But I know they must be crazy. Don't see their misfortune. Yes, they just lazy. Je suis a grand zombie. My yellow belt of choice on. Ain't afraid of no tomcat. Fill my brains with poison. Walk through the fire. Fly through the smoke. See my enemy at the end of their rope. Walk on pins and needles, see what they can do. Walk on gilded splinter with the king of the Zulu.
So as you can hear, this is a really trippy album. And they recorded it for the Atlantic label. And Ahmet Erdogan, who's the head of the label, he basically comes to him and says, what do you expect me to do with this music? Because he has no idea how to market it. But they kind of release it, they just push it out the door, and it gets traction. It gets good press and is well received. I think the timing was good, and it's the late 60s when there's a lot of probably drug use going on, and pretty much probably everybody that put it on fired up a joint or maybe dropped some LSD. They got some nice critical acclaim, some of which singled out Harold. This one I think is particularly funny. No mashugana appurtenances can hide the outstanding arrangement by Dr. John's producer, Harold Battiste. They overshadow what they're supposed to accompany. And then this one is great too. It's this coupled with Dr. John's seemingly improvised, fascinatingly colorful vocal ramblings. And then it was arranged and produced to absolute perfection by Harold Battiste. So, sorry. Right away, they start on a follow-up album, which became Babylon. And this was actually a more ambitious album in terms of the music. And Dr. John, again, sums it up in Under a Hoodoo Moon. he talks about Grigori being perceived as a hip album, but the challenging music was actually on the Babylon album. And they're not only odd time signatures. So a common time signature for pop music would be 4/4, just meaning you count it in cycles of 4. So if you listen to most stuff that's on the radio, you can count along and go 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. And you can't do that with a lot of the stuff on Babylon. And not only are they odd time signatures, they change in one song. And Barefoot Lady is a classic example of this. So I'm going to try to, I hope you can hear me. I'm going to try to count out some of the measures at spots as it plays. One, two, three, four, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. 1. So very challenging stuff to play and play so it sounds like music. So just to kind of orient you to what some of these time signatures mean, like 11/4, the song that might be most familiar to people if you're Allman Brothers fans, one of their big early hits was Whippin' Post. And the hook rhythm that goes through that is actually in 11. Dun 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 dun. That's another example of somebody playing an 11. One of the neat things about the album, it was one of those double fold albums that you used to get when you actually had LPs. And there's 2 pictures inside. Mac Rebennack is on one side and Harold is on the other side. Oops, sorry. So there's a couple of other intervening albums Harold's not involved in, and frankly, they're somewhat disasters with the way they were done. But he does make a return for Dr. John's Gumbo in 1971, which has the classic Iko Iko. Well, it has a lot of classic tunes, but the one that we probably mostly hear from that album is Iko Iko. But these projects with these kind of defining projects aren't the only things he's doing. He's into just a lot of stuff. He's doing a Barry White session for Jackie DeShannon. Is a New Orleans singer, Lydia Marcel, who did some compositions by Jane McNeely, who was somebody that Harold worked with that had a lot of respect. He described her stuff as kind of Broadway style. Hal Mack Productions, he's got a production company with Mac Rebennack, among other things. They did 2 albums for Wayne Talbert, but that ended badly, primarily because of Mac's drug use, and Harold couldn't deal with it. The debut album for King Floyd, there was an English band of women called The Cake, sometimes described as like a female version of the Beatles, 2 albums for them. And then Hal Mack morphed into Hal Mel. So that's Melvin Lasty, and they did an album together called Alone Together. There's a London tour with Tammy Lynn. There's an interesting blues album with Plas Johnson. So remember we talked about Plas Johnson as the tenor player, one of the brothers in the Johnson Brothers from way back in Harold's history. He would be known, so Plas wound up out on the West Coast and is a very prolific session player, and his signature, what people would identify him for, is the Pink Panther theme. That's his tenor saxophone on the Pink Panther. He does an album called The Blues that Harold's involved in. Ray Brown was the bass player on that, who's probably the best jazz bass player ever. And at one point they're talking to the guys in the sessions, asking each of them to come up with tunes. So Ray Brown has this blues tune and he starts singing the parts to the other musicians to teach it to him. And somebody makes a comment, say, where'd you make up this song? Out in the parking lot? So it becomes Parking Lot Blues, and it's the minor hit off the album. And then he goes into a period, Harold goes into a period he calls hitting and missing. Some successes, some just treading water. He has a 1977 tour with Marilyn McCoo and Billy Davis. So think Fifth Dimension. They were 2 of the 5 members of the Fifth Dimension, and Marilyn McCoo in particular was the voice. She was the one that you heard singing most of the lead. And he really thought of that as kind of a cleansing experience after this plantation experience that he described with Sonny and Cher, more Sonny than Cher. He was very happy to go on this tour, and he basically turned the reins at some point, turned the tour leadership over to the keyboard player that had been in the band. He has kind of another AFO analog shot, National Association of New Orleans Musicians. It doesn't get any support and goes dormant after a couple of years. Minister of Music at the Harvest Tabernacle Choir. And he puts together this band of expats, New Orleans expats on the West Coast, calls them the New Orleans natives. They get a regular gig at the Club Lingerie and also some Southern California dates. And this is what I love about this, is that this is like one of the concerts you'll see around Jazz Fest in New Orleans, where you get these people who have independent reputations in different bands and put them together, smash them together in one band for a concert, except they do this on a recurring basis. Some of the names should be very familiar to people. Leo Nocentelli was the guitar player for the Meters. Henry Butler, we lost him fairly recently. Jerry Drummondville, tenor sax player. He was actually on the West Coast. He was doing session work, and he was the liquid saxophone solo on Tonight's the Night, the Rod Stewart song. And he's also doing some teaching. In particular, he works up a program for the Los Angeles Trade Technical College that never gets used, but it lays a foundation for his approach when he becomes a part of UNO. And there's a tribute to Ed Blackwell in 1987 that actually has a reunion of the American Jazz Quintet, and they get all of the original players back. So in 1989, Ellis Marcellus gets recruited to create a jazz performance program at UNO, and he invites Harold to come back and be part of that with him. And so Harold, after not quite 30 years on the West Coast, actually comes back. And he stated his philosophy for the way he approached the curriculum was, I focused on ear use. Ear use involves playing notes and chords that are pleasing to the ears, with the optimum word being playing, which is associated with fun. And so this is where I crossed paths with Harold, not as early as 1989. It probably wasn't until 1999. And I had Harold for some theory class. I might have had him for some piano stuff. I can't remember for sure. And one thing I remember very vividly in the theory class is he came in one day with a sheet of chords. So it's just a piece of paper with various chords written on staffs running down the sheet of paper. And he starts talking about them, and he asks the students about the chords. What do they think about these chords? And there's one chord that has a note in it that has a double flat, which is not wrong, but it's unusual. Because what happens when you flat a note, you drop it a half step, so it's between two notes in the scale. And when you double flat it, you drop it 2 half steps or a whole step, which means it just becomes the note below. So if it's a B and it's a B flat, and you do double flat, it just becomes an A. So most people, when they write out a chord or transcription, they write it as an A instead of a B double flat. And then there are some reasons why you might want to write it as a double flat, but hardly anybody does it. So he's got this chord, and he asks the students, he says, so what do you think of that? What do you think is going on with that? And so it's a relatively young class. I was in my early 40s when I was taking it, but I'm doing it with all these kids that are right after high school. So around 20, maybe late teens. And they start expounding on all these philosophical reasons as to why it could be used as a double flat. Like, oh, I think the chords are moving from here to here, so the composer is trying to indicate this, whatever, a bunch of explanations. And finally, the energy dies down, so it's quiet. And Harold, just in the middle of all this quiet, says, I think it's a mistake. And I thought it was classically Harold, because he's really saying, what does it sound like? Who cares about the theory? What does this stuff sound like? And really, I think at UNO is where he really distinguished himself as being a mentor and developing talent, not just being a teacher, but just really mentoring people. He produced several recordings. The earliest one was essentially it was a named comment under the name of one of the students, and had a bunch of other students as the players on the album. Well, one of the guys is Brian Blade. And if you've been paying attention to the Grammys recently, you would know that Brian Blade just got himself a Grammy for working with the Chick Corea Trio. Here's the album up here, and it's his third Grammy. So this is the kind of guy, this is the kind of mentorship that Harold is providing. He started off these series of albums. He starts with calling The Next Generation. With this, has this lineup of people on it. A lot of these names should be familiar to people, particularly as New Orleans music fans. Nicholas Payton may be the most high profile one. Nicholas has made a really strong name for himself as a kind of a nouveau New Orleans style. And then he got into this Miles Davis kind of bitches brew kind of style of music. And then Jesse McBride has really picked up the mantle on that. He was kind of a protege of Harold, and he really has kept this whole next generation thing going. And the other gift that Harold gave us is these things called silver books. And I actually photographed the silver books that I had from when I was taking the UNO program. They're what you would call fake books. So what a fake book is, when a musician's on the bandstand, particularly if it's a casual gig or a pickup gig, you don't know what somebody's going to request. Maybe they say Melancholy Baby. And the chances that everybody on the bandstand knows Melancholy Baby by heart is about 0. So it's very common you get these musicians to have these thick books of single page, what are called lead sheets. Basically, it's one page that outlines the form of a song, gives you the melody and the chords, and maybe a suggestion about style and how you play it. And they're called fake books because they allow you to fake the song. And they evolved so that the jazz people are hipper. So there was this variation of fake books that came to be called real books. And they were bootleg initially, but then they became legitimate. And the quality was a lot better actually when they became legitimate. So Harold essentially created this for the New Orleans repertoire. And there's 3 editions of it, 3, so they're not overlapping. They cover different material. And you have a number of songs inside. So this is the table of contents. At the back, you have the biographies of the composers. And for each of those songs, you get this kind of descriptive sheet that basically tells you what the essence of the song is, and then you get the lead sheet. Whoops. Sorry, I didn't mean to do that. There we go. And 12's it. That Ellis Marcellus song I played for you, as well as most of the other early stuff that these guys were playing, is part of the contents. And then there was an AFO revival. It actually started as a revival of the label. In 1976, Harold went back and took a bunch of these old recordings, some of which had not seen the light of day, and released a 4 LP package called New Orleans Heritage Jazz 1956 to 1966. He pressed 1,000 copies of it. He didn't know how to price it, so he said, okay, $19.76, that was his price. Well, if you go on Amazon now and look up this, so this is vinyl, 4 LPs, there's a listing for a copy of this for $450. And then John Broven in 1991, he was a music scholar, I guess you'd call him, writer. He runs Ace Records in England, and he prevailed upon Harold to put together some compilation releases that covered more than jazz. They covered R&B and other stuff that AFO produced. And they came out as respectively Gumbo Stew, More Gumbo Stew, and Still Spicy Gumbo Stew. And that ultimately evolved into the AFO Foundation. which you can still find online now. And it produces music, but it's more of a support organization to keep the dream alive. And it even includes releases like The Sound of Harold's Horn, which is stuff that came out of his personal catalog of recordings. And we finally lost him in 2015. If you want to follow up and learn more about Harold, these are some of the things I would recommend. His autobiography, Unfinished Blues, that he did with Karen, who is on the session. Really happy to see Karen here. The website is a great source of information. Dr. John's biography actually has some interesting stuff in it because he crossed paths so much with Harold and he cites him quite a bit. And there's some other stuff. David Kunian did a thesis that wasn't specifically on Harold, but it covered the modern jazz period and particularly the AFO period, which offers a lot of insight into that operation in that period. And there's some other stuff. You can hit some of the Sonny and Cher biographies, but I mean, there's references in there, but they're not real helpful. One of the things I found very interesting is, of course, in Harold's biography, Sonny and Cher are all over that, at least for a certain period. Dr. John's biography, he cites and talks about Harold probably in about 8 or 10 different pages. There's an early biography of Cher. It's not an autobiography. And Harold Battiste is all through that. Maybe half a dozen times, 8 times, 10 times. So Sonny Bono writes an autobiography, and he mentions Harold Battiste once in a throwaway fashion. And so I think that's just a manifestation of what Harold was talking about working for him. It really was like a plantation mentality. He saves Sonny's songs, and that's what he gets. He gets one citation in his autobiography. So thank you all for listening. I'm going to turn it back to Jason. I know I ran a little long.
No, that was okay, Dave. I mean, I learned a ton, and thank you so much for that presentation. Does anybody have any questions for Dave? We have time for questions. If you do have questions, if you don't want to ask them yourselves, you can put them in the chat, and I can ask them of Dave. But does anybody have any questions?
Hi, this is Karen. I'm curious. I think Harlis Battiste, Harold's son, is on. Are you on, Harlis?
Yes, I am.
Oh.
Hey, Harley.
Hi, Harlis. Can you respond to Dave's understanding of the spelling of your family name?
Hi. Well, I'm fine with letting that know. You mean in terms of the origin, or what he had?
The origin and the reference to Baptiste, because Dr. Batt told me something different, so I want to have you clarify since you're his son.
Oh well, I do know there was some. I only know from hearsay, but I do remember there being some discussion about it being derived from a different spelling of the 2 T's. Or 1 T was common, and the BAPT was also very common historically. But I don't really specifically. I don't remember the actual story. I know that you had done some more work on that, so. It wasn't anything that stood out to me as
right. My understanding my understanding from Dr. Batt is that there was no P, Dave. That we discussed that.
Oh, okay.
There was no Baptiste in their family lineage, to my understanding. That's why I asked Harlis to speak to that. Also in your, and then I will turn it over to other people, the misspelling of Marzique's name. Both of her names are misspelled.
Oh, sorry.
Okay. And then I'll turn it over to people, and maybe someday we can have a private conversation about other things, but
Sure.
Yeah. Nobody else has any other questions?
Yeah, I don't have a question, Dave. I do want to thank you for it. This is Janice Brown. I was Harold's personal assistant for a very long time prior to Katrina. And there were some things that you left out, but you probably didn't know, and other people need to know that Karen worked a very long time on Harold's memoir. So she knows him very intimately, just as much as I do. I mean, a very, very long time. But your attendees ought to know that Harold was not only pivotal in just not only in Sonny and Cher's careers, even though Cher may have mentioned Harold a bunch of times, she really wasn't that cooperative. Is that a good word, Karen?
That's a good word.
But he also trained other musical directors. The musical director for Natalie Cole that she had for years, Gail Dietrich, he literally mentored and trained her. And the musical director for Marilyn McCoo and Billy Davis, after he left them for the show, that musical director, I think is Daryl Austin. That person was mentored and trained by Harold too. So he touched the lives of a lot of musicians and literally trained them. LTD, the R&B group LTD, they literally lived in one of Harold's buildings. I mean, he touched the lives of a lot of musicians that are still alive today. And people just don't know it. He was a living and walking treasure, living right here on Esplanade Ridge. People didn't know it. But if anybody else wants to know more, you guys need to pick up Karen's book. I'm doing a shameless plug for Karen. So
Okay.
that's it, Dave. I didn't want to take up your time, but I want to thank you for spotlighting Mr. Bat. We loved him, and I really appreciate you doing this.
Yeah.
You're welcome.
Yeah. And by the way, Dave, the OJs, a disco band? No, sir. They are a very beloved R&B band with incredible, 60 years in the rhythm and blues canon. They were not a disco band ever. I take umbrage with that. And then, we can discuss the other things about Harold specifically.
Sure.
A lot is left out. I know you speak of what you know, but it's just important for people to know the truth, because Harold decided to write his book because he read Mac's book and read Sonny's book, and he was highly insulted and infuriated at being diminished in the way that he was diminished. And so we, speaking of Harless and the other Battiste children and Janice, we and Jesse McBride as well, we always are trying to lift Harold up. He was a very modest man, but a very strong-willed man as well. And so this is a great tribute to him. But there are some things that are incorrect and that I disagree with. But it is appreciated that you brought his work and his legacy to a new audience. And I'll be happy to talk with you anytime.
Sure.
Yeah, the music.
Are you talking, Jason? We don't hear anything.
The question was about Harold and teaching his children to play music.
Raymond III is a bassist. I know that.
Yeah, much of the teaching was through osmosis. We lived it. Music was in our ears all the time. And my older brother, he took it a little further than the rest of us. I played a little bit when I was younger, and I played just by ear, just by hearing his music. But I'm saying my brother has taken it further and continues that on.
Yeah. That's for sure.
Couple other things. Anybody else have any other questions? We got a bunch of thank yous and great presentations, and appreciate the music clips help to tell this story. Dave, thank you for the presentation. Also, thanks for sharing your insights and experience with Mr. Battiste. Very educational. Enjoyed this immensely. So thank you so much, everybody, for attending tonight. I hope we, in an hour, I'm sure we can put together a couple more hours. So we'll have to, continue on and hopefully we'll go into even further depth about his life. But I want to thank everybody for attending, and we hope to see everybody on April 20th for our next member lecture series. So thank you so much. And if you're on the R&B class, we'll see you on Wednesday night because we've got that going on for the final class then. So thank you, Dave, so much. We appreciate it, and we thank everybody for taking part. Thank you, Karen, Harless, and Janice, and everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Everybody be safe.
Yeah.
Y'all.